The dog weighed 110 pounds of trained muscle and scar tissue, and it had put 3 handlers in the infirmary. Nobody went near it. Nobody was supposed to. Then Emily Brooks walked into that kennel with her hands at her sides. No treats, no commands, nothing. And the animal stopped pacing. It dropped its head. It pressed its flank against her leg and stood there like it was guarding her. Victor Hale watched through the security feed and felt something cold move through him. He didn't know what it meant yet. He would. If this story already has you hooked, follow along, hit like, and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this one travels. The morning Emily Brooks got fired started like every other morning at Pinecrest Regional Hospital, which is to say it started badly. She was 40 minutes into a double shift that was supposed to be a single when the overhead lights in Bay 4 flickered out and the backup generator kicked in 2 seconds late. 2 seconds was enough. The monitor on the patient in 4C lost its reading, alarmed, reset, and by the time Emily got there, the attending physician, Dr. Marcus Flint, was already standing in the doorway looking at her like she'd personally cut the power. "Where were you?" "Changing a dressing in Bay 2. The light." "I don't need the editorial." He turned back into the hallway. "Get a tech up here for the monitor and find out why that generator hesitated." She found out. She wrote it up. She submitted the maintenance request and CC'd the facilities director and kept a copy for herself because she'd learned early at Pinecrest that you kept copies of everything. The request sat in the queue for 11 days. She resubmitted. It sat for 4 more. That was how things worked at Pinecrest Regional Hospital in Raven Falls, Montana. A city of about 60,000 people wedged between the Rockies and a paper mill economy that had been dying since the 90s. The hospital was the largest employer in the county, which meant it operated more or less like it could do whatever it wanted. Emily had been there 14 months. She'd come in from the travel nurse pool, taken a permanent position faster than most people did because she was good at her job and because the ER was chronically understaffed, and because nobody else wanted the overnight slots. She worked the nights nobody claimed. She took the difficult patients, the combative ones, the confused elderly patients who screamed at staff, the overdoses and the trauma cases and the codes that left everyone else shaking in the break room while Emily charted and moved on to the next room. She wasn't liked for it. She was resented for it, which she understood. There's a particular kind of resentment that develops in places where bad systems have been in place long enough that people start defending them. And anyone who functions well inside a bad system is seen as an accusation rather than an asset. Flint was the worst of them, but not the only one. Charge nurse Donna Price scheduled Emily for doubles whenever she could, paired her with the newest techs, left her off the communication chain for department meetings so she'd show up having missed policy changes and then get written up for the gaps. It was subtle enough that Emily couldn't prove intent, which was the point. She had a system. She documented everything. She kept her head down. She did the work. And then one Tuesday in March, she made the mistake of asking the wrong question. The patient's name was listed on the intake form as Gerald Wynn, 64, admitted for chest pain. Emily had taken a report from the night nurse, done her own assessment, and something was bothering her. Not about the patient exactly. His vitals were stable, his pain was managed. It was the transfer order. He was being sent to the 3rd floor. Cardiology, which made sense, but the order had come through on the administrative track, not the physician track, and the attending signature at the bottom was Flint's, except Flint had signed out at 7, and it was now 8:45. She flagged the charge nurse. Donna barely looked up from her computer. "Transfer order looks off," Emily said. "Attending signature is post-checkout." "It's a pre-signed order. Dr. Flint authorized it yesterday." "For a patient who came in this morning?" Donna looked up then. Her expression was the one she used when she wanted you to understand you were wasting her time. "The order covers the protocol. If you have concerns, put them in the chart." Emily put them in the chart. She also pulled the last 30 days of transfer logs for the East Wing, because the Gerald Wynn order wasn't the first one that had looked strange. She'd noticed 2 others in the past 3 weeks. Different patients, different attending names, same administrative track, same 3rd floor destination. She was still cross-referencing at her workstation when Victor Hale walked into the ER. He was the head of hospital security, which at Pinecrest was a title that covered a lot of territory. He had a staff of 18 and an office suite on the 2nd floor, and he'd been at the hospital longer than most of the medical staff. He wore the kind of authority that came from institutional permanence rather than competence, the confidence of a man who had outlasted enough people that he'd stopped worrying about challengers. He was 51, former county sheriff's deputy, built like he'd once been athletic, and had spent the last decade converting that frame into something softer and more comfortable. He wore his security director badge on a lanyard that he rarely bothered to lift when he swiped his keycard, because the doors opened for him without it. He stopped beside Emily's workstation. He didn't look at her screens, he looked at her. "You submitted a maintenance report yesterday on the East Wing generator." 11 days ago, initially. Yesterday was the resubmission. "You also copied the facilities director." Standard procedure. The facilities director reports to the COO. The COO has questions about why a floor nurse is generating paperwork that reaches executive level. Emily saved her file, closed it, and turned to face him. "The generator hesitated during a patient monitoring incident. I documented it because that's what we're supposed to do when patient safety is implicated." "And the transfer log you pulled 20 minutes ago?" She hadn't submitted that anywhere. She'd been looking at it on her own workstation. She hadn't even printed it. He was watching her screen remotely. She kept her face neutral. "I had questions about a transfer order. I was doing my due diligence." He tucked his thumbs into his belt loops, a gesture that probably looked casual and probably wasn't. "You've been here 14 months. You've generated more paperwork than people who've been here 14 years. Some people find that admirable. Personally, I find it exhausting." He tilted his head. "How do you find it?" "Necessary," Emily said. He smiled. It didn't reach anywhere useful. "Pack your things. You're finished here." The words landed in the middle of the busy ER like something dropped from a height. Two nurses nearby stopped moving. A tech pretended to look at a chart. Emily looked at Victor Hale for a long moment. "We'll see," she said. She didn't pack her things. She finished her shift, 6 more hours, 2 more patients, a laceration repair on a 14-year-old who was terrified of needles and needed someone to talk to him while she worked, which she did, keeping her voice even and steady the whole time, hands moving with the practiced economy of someone who'd done this in conditions considerably more difficult than a well-lit ER bay. At the end of the shift, she found her keycard had been deactivated. It didn't open the staff locker room. It didn't open the break room. It didn't open the ER bay doors from the outside. She used the public entrance. She got her coat from her locker, which opened with a physical key, not a keycard, because she'd noticed early on that the keycard system had gaps and had requested an old-fashioned lock installed, a request that had been mocked and then grudgingly accommodated. And she sat in her car in the parking garage for a while, not crying, not panicking, just thinking. She'd known this was a possibility. She'd known it the moment she pulled that transfer log and understood what she was looking at. She just hadn't expected it to move this fast. Hale had been monitoring her workstation in real time, which meant he'd been watching her for a while, which meant the thing she'd stumbled into was big enough to warrant that kind of surveillance. She reached under her seat and found the small encrypted drive she kept there. She'd started copying files to it 3 weeks ago, when she'd first noticed the anomalies. Nothing that would violate HIPAA, no identifying patient information, just administrative metadata, timestamps, the structural bones of what was happening, transfer patterns, authorization chains, billing codes that didn't match procedures. She plugged a second drive into her laptop, copied the first drive to it, and addressed an encrypted email to a contact she hadn't used in 4 years. She typed, "Pinecrest Regional, Raven Falls, MT. Pattern match to what we discussed. Moving fast. Sending what I have." She attached the file and sent it before she could second-guess herself. Then she sat back and looked at the parking garage ceiling. Her name wasn't Emily Brooks, not originally. That was the name on her nursing license, on her Pinecrest ID, on her lease agreement for the apartment on Callaway Street. It was her legal name now, had been for 3 years through a process she'd completed when she left the Army. Before that, her name had been Emily Calvert. Captain Emily Calvert, 18th Special Operations Detachment, attached to a medical support element whose full designation she still wasn't supposed to say out loud. She'd spent 6 years doing trauma medicine in places that didn't appear on deployment rosters. She'd treated gunshot wounds by headlamp in the back of vehicles moving at speed. She'd performed surgical interventions with instruments that weren't designed for surgery because they were the only instruments available. She'd kept people alive until someone better equipped could take over. And sometimes she'd kept people alive when there was no one better equipped coming. She'd been good at it. Good enough that when she separated from the Army, an agency she was still not at liberty to name had suggested she might be useful in a different capacity. They'd given her a new name, paid for her nursing board certification, and pointed her at Raven Falls, Montana, where something was happening inside the largest hospital in the county that nobody could see clearly from the outside. She'd spent 14 months building a picture. She was pretty sure she had enough. She wasn't supposed to trigger an extraction yet. She was supposed to wait for the designated contact window, 10 days out. But the keycard deactivation and Hale's monitoring meant her window had just closed, and she'd been trained well enough to know that when the timeline accelerates, you accelerate with it. She started her car and drove home and slept for 3 hours and was back at the hospital at 6 the next morning, because she still had a job until she received a formal written termination, and she intended to use every minute of it. The written termination arrived at 8:15, delivered by a hospital HR coordinator named Sandra, who seemed genuinely uncomfortable about the whole thing and kept apologizing in small ways that didn't amount to anything useful. "There's a 30-day severance. I know what the contract says," Emily told her, "and you can collect your personal items from the locker room. I have to accompany you." "I know." Sandra was quiet for a moment. "I heard you were good at your job." Emily looked at her. "I was." She collected her things, not much, a few personal items, the good stethoscope she'd bought herself, a photograph she kept taped inside her locker door of a mountain range she wasn't going to identify. Sandra walked her to the exit and swiped her own card to open the door and stood there as Emily walked out into the cold Montana morning. She was in the parking lot when her phone buzzed. A text from a number she didn't recognize, which meant it was from someone she knew very well. Received. Confirming pattern. Do not re-enter facility. Stand by. She texted back. Standing by is not currently viable. 3 seconds. Explain. She typed, they have the K9 unit on extended patrol. New routes added 48 hours ago. East corridor to loading bay. Same route as the transfers. A longer pause this time. Then, how do you know the K9 routes? She thought about how to answer that. She decided on the simplest version. The dog told me. But the K9 unit at Pinecrest Regional had been purchased through a federal grant for hospital security, one of a wave of similar programs that had emerged after a series of incidents at medical facilities across the country. The dog's name was Recon. She hadn't given him that name. That was what was on his file. And he was 4 years old, a Belgian Malinois, military contract trained, which meant he'd come from a program that she had spent 2 years supporting in a professional capacity that she could not currently mention. She'd met him on her 3rd day at Pinecrest, when she'd been given the orientation tour that included the security facilities. Recon was kenneled in the basement, separate from everything else, and his handler had seemed almost reluctant to bring her in because the dog had a reputation. He'd put 2 handlers in the infirmary in his first month, and a visiting administrator had required stitches after getting too close to his kennel. Everyone understood that Recon was an asset and also a liability, and the primary strategy for managing that tension was to keep him away from most people and use him only for specific patrol routes. When Emily had walked into the kennel, the dog had come off the back wall in a single fluid motion that the handler had started a warning for and then hadn't finished because Recon had stopped 3 feet from Emily, dropped his nose, and stood there making a sound in his chest that wasn't a growl. It was something else, something she recognized. She'd reached out her hand, which you were not supposed to do with a dog that had put people in the infirmary, and he'd pressed his nose into her palm and then turned and pressed his flank against her leg, like he was checking whether she was still there. The handler had stared. "He doesn't do that," the handler said. "I know," she said. She hadn't explained further, but she'd made a point of checking in with Recon every few weeks. Not formally, not on any schedule anyone would notice, just pausing near the kennel when she passed, a few seconds of contact, enough that the dog knew her presence. And when the security patrol routes had expanded 48 hours ago, she'd noticed it because Recon's movement had changed. He'd been bringing something back on his coat from the loading area, a smell she knew from storage facilities that handled specific types of medical supply, a chemical compound used in the preservation of tissue samples, not the kind you ordered through standard hospital procurement. She hadn't put that in her report. She'd put it in the encrypted file. Decat. She was sitting in her car in the parking lot of a diner 3 blocks from the hospital, drinking bad coffee from the paper cup she'd bought as a reason to be there, when the call came. Not a text this time. An actual call, which meant it was serious. She answered without saying anything. "We have a problem." The voice on the other end was a woman's voice, clipped, precise, the kind of voice that had learned economy of language in environments where extra words cost time you didn't have. "There's a federal hold on the investigation timeline. 24-hour minimum before we can get people on the ground." "That's too long." "I'm aware." "Something's moving. The loading bay patterns, the transfer rate has doubled in the last week. I know what the data shows." "Then you know they're clearing out. Whatever they have in there, they're moving it before anyone can lock it down." A pause. "What's your current status?" "Parking lot. I was formally terminated this morning." "That's actually useful. You're not on their monitoring anymore. Can you maintain observation without entry?" She thought about the hospital layout. The loading bay was on the east side, accessible from a service road that ran along the back of the building. There was a municipal lot on the corner of the service road and 5th Street, which had good sight lines to the bay doors and was public property. "Yes." "Do that. Don't go inside, don't make contact with anyone inside. We need what you have documented, and we need the chain of custody clean." "Understood." "Emily," the voice shifted just slightly. "You're going to be fine. You did everything right." She hung up. She moved her car to the municipal lot on 5th Street and opened her phone's camera and set it on a small magnetic mount on the dashboard and started documenting the loading bay. It was quiet for 40 minutes. Then a white panel van she hadn't seen before pulled around the back of the hospital and backed up to the loading bay doors. 2 security staff in Pinecrest uniforms came out and started moving equipment cases into the van. Big cases, the industrial kind, olive drab, the color that anyone who'd spent time in military supply operations would recognize without having to think about it. Her phone was still recording. She kept her hands in her lap and her expression neutral, and she watched. The van's plates were registered to a medical logistics company. She knew that because she'd run the plate in her head against the pattern she'd memorized from the transfer documentation, and that company name appeared in the billing codes twice. She was still watching when her phone buzzed. A text from a Pinecrest ER number she recognized. Not a nurse. A tech named Danny Okafor, 23 years old, 2 months into his first real job, earnest in the way of someone who hadn't been worn down yet. "Emily, where are you? Something bad is happening inside." She stared at the message. She typed, "What's happening?" The response took 4 minutes, which was long enough for her to consider 13 different scenarios. When it came, it was 2 words and then a photograph. Armed patient. The photograph showed the east corridor of the ER. It was blurry, taken fast, at an angle. It showed a man she recognized from the transfer documentation. Gerald Wynn, 64, admitted for chest pain, except Gerald Wynn was standing in the middle of the hallway, and the thing in his hand was not something you were supposed to be able to get into a hospital. She looked at the image for exactly 2 seconds. Then she got out of her car and walked toward the hospital entrance. She knew she'd been told not to go inside. She went inside anyway. The ER waiting room was the public face of the hospital, the part anyone could walk into, and Emily walked into it at the same pace she always used when she was approaching something that required careful management, not fast enough to signal alarm, not slow enough to telegraph hesitation. Danny Okafor was behind the triage desk, which was technically outside the secure treatment area, and his face when he saw her was the face of someone who had been hoping very hard that something would happen and hadn't been sure what. "He got out of the room," Danny said, low, fast. "We don't know how. The attending called security, and then security called Victor, and then... Where is he now?" "Last we knew, East Corridor, Bay 8 direction." "How many patients in that wing?" 6. 2 of them are transfers waiting for... Who else is back there?" "Dr. Simons, 2 nurses, One tech. She processed that. Where's the lockdown? Victor said don't lock down. He said handle it internally. Danny's voice had something tight in it. Emily, the guy has a... I know. She was already moving. She didn't go through the secure door because her keycard was deactivated. She went to the family consultation entrance, which was a different door and used a different system, and which she'd noticed had a 4-second delay between failed swipes before it locked completely, which meant if you had the right card from the right person... She looked at Danny. He looked at his badge. He looked at her. He unclipped it and handed it over without her having to ask. She was through the door in 6 seconds. The east corridor smelled like it always did, antiseptic and the particular chemical undercurrent of equipment that ran constantly. But the sound was wrong. It was too quiet in the way that places get quiet when everyone in them has stopped moving. She found the first nurse, Rebecca, pressed against the wall outside Bay 6 with her hands at her sides and her face doing something that wasn't quite panic but was adjacent to it. Where? Emily said. Bay 8. He's asking for someone named Carver. He keeps saying it. Dr. Carver. There's no Dr. Carver on staff. I know. Rebecca's voice dropped. Emily, he's not... I don't think he's actually a cardiac patient. His hands... I know, Emily said again. She was already past her. Gerald Wynn, 64, admitted for chest pain. The chest pain had been real. She was fairly certain. Stress response, maybe, or a genuine cardiac event that had been secondary to something else. But the transfer order that had been pre-signed, the administrative routing, the timing. Gerald Wynn was connected to whatever was coming out the loading bay in those olive drab cases. She didn't know exactly how, but she understood the general shape of it, and the general shape of it told her that the people who'd been operating inside Pinecrest had decided the timeline was compromised and started moving their assets out. And Gerald Wynn was either one of those assets, or he'd figured out what was happening to him and decided he wasn't going to let it finish. She went to Bay 8. The door was open. The attending physician, Dr. Simons, was inside, standing beside the bed, and the look on his face was the look of a man who had made several catastrophic decisions in the last 20 minutes and understood all of them clearly, but too late. A tech was against the back wall. The room's single window showed the gray Montana afternoon. Gerald Wynn was in the center of the room. He was wearing a hospital gown and he was 64, and he looked like he'd been through something significant before he ever got admitted. Deep-set eyes and skin with the grayish quality of chronic stress. And he was holding a weapon that had come from somewhere it absolutely should not have come from and pointing it at the room in a way that covered everyone and nothing specifically. He looked at Emily when she came in. His hands weren't steady. I don't know you, Psych, he said. I'm a nurse. I was a nurse here. She kept her voice at the register she used for patients in crisis, not soothing exactly, which could read as condescending, but level, like the floor under his feet. I'm not security. I'm not hospital administration. My name is Emily. I need Dr. Carver. Dr. Carver isn't here. Can you tell me why you need him? His jaw worked. They know I know. They were going to move me, and I was never... He stopped. His hand trembled. I have documentation. I have everything. But they're moving it out. They're moving everything out right now. Emily heard something in the hallway behind her. Movement. More than one person. She looked at Gerald Wynn directly. I know they're moving it. I've been watching the loading bay. His eyes changed. I've been here for 14 months, she said. I didn't come here by accident, and I need you to put that down so I can help you actually finish this. The sound in the hallway got louder. Victor Hale's voice reached her from the corridor. Stand aside. This is a security matter. Gerald Wynn's grip on the weapon went tight. Emily didn't turn around. She kept her eyes on Gerald Wynn and she said quietly, Don't look at him. Look at me. She had 3 seconds before Hale came through the door, maybe less. She held Gerald Wynn's gaze and she held out her hand. Gerald Wynn looked at her hand for a long moment. Long enough that Emily could hear Victor Hale's footsteps stop just outside the doorway, could feel the weight of the decision happening in real time, could see the exact moment the old man's shoulder dropped half an inch, and the trembling in his grip shifted from tension to exhaustion. He placed the weapon in her palm. It was heavier than it looked. Military grade, not a civilian piece, which told her something she filed away immediately. She kept her fingers loose around it, non-threatening, and turned to face the doorway just as Victor Hale came through it with two security officers behind him. He stopped when he saw what was in her hand. "Give that to me," he said. "I will. In a moment." She kept her body angled between Hale and Wynne, which was instinct more than calculation. "Mr. Wynne needs medical attention. He's in cardiac distress and he's been on this floor without adequate monitoring for... That's not your concern anymore. You don't work here." "Then I'm a civilian who just prevented a potential shooting. And as a civilian, I'm asking you to call EMS and get this man evaluated before you do anything else." She held the weapon out, grip first. "Take it." Hale took it. He looked at her with something that had moved past annoyance into something older and colder. "You're going to regret coming back in here." "Probably," she said, and turned back to Gerald Wynne. They let her stay with Wynne for 11 minutes, which was long enough to get his vitals stable and his breathing under control, and to say, in a voice low enough that the security officer standing in the doorway couldn't hear clearly, "When they take you, don't say anything about Carver. Don't say anything about documentation. Say you panicked. Say it was a breakdown." Wynne looked at her with eyes that had seen something and hadn't recovered from it. "They're going to bury this. They're going to try. I have records going back 2 years, clinical trial data, patients who didn't consent. Some of them..." He stopped. His jaw tightened. "Some of them didn't make it." She held his wrist, fingers on his pulse, which was the reason she was allowed to be this close. "I know. We have most of it." "Most?" "I'm working on the rest." He looked at her for a long second. "Who are you?" She didn't answer that. She adjusted the blood pressure cuff on his arm and wrote his numbers on the chart Danny had brought in, because charting was normal, and normal-looking things could be done without anyone paying close attention. And she wrote the numbers in her standard handwriting, and at the bottom of the vitals section she wrote a set of numbers that weren't vitals, that were the specific storage location codes she'd seen on 3 of the transferred files, numbers that corresponded to the billing records she'd sent in the encrypted file, but that she hadn't been able to fully decode until Gerald Wynne said clinical trial data and the pattern completed itself. She tore that section off before she handed the chart to the officer. She folded it twice and put it in her pocket. Then Hale's officers took Wynne down the corridor and Emily was left standing in Bay 8 alone, and she had maybe 30 seconds before someone told her to leave. She used them. The supply closet at the end of the east corridor was the kind of space that appeared in hospital blueprints as storage. General, and in practice, functioned as the repository for equipment that was broken, outdated, or waiting for someone to make a decision about it. Emily had used it twice in 14 months for purposes that weren't storage. Once to have a conversation with a distressed family member away from the general ER noise. Once to take a 10-minute break she technically wasn't authorized to take. She knew the closet had a network access panel on the back wall because she'd watched a tech work on it once, and she knew the panel connected to the hospital's internal administrative system because the tech had complained about the routing. She had 4 minutes before Hale would think to look for her. Maybe 3. The access panel was exactly where she remembered it. She didn't have network credentials anymore. Her login had been deactivated with her keycard. But the panel's maintenance mode didn't require credentials. It required a 6-digit code that was printed on a sticker on the inside of the panel door, which was a security failure she'd noticed 14 months ago and had written up in a maintenance report that had sat in the same queue as the generator report. She pulled up the administrative file system in maintenance mode. She navigated to the 3rd-floor patient transfer logs. She found the folder structure she'd seen in the billing data, a clinical designation she didn't recognize, a series of alphanumeric codes, and underneath those, files, hundreds of them. Patient intake forms, consent documentation, something labeled protocol variance reports, which was a phrase she recognized from military medical research contexts and which absolutely had no business existing inside a civilian hospital administrative system. She couldn't download anything. She had no drive, no connection to her encrypted system. What she had was the camera on Danny Okafor's badge, which she'd borrowed to get through the door and which was still clipped to her scrub pocket. Most hospital badges didn't have cameras. Danny's did because Danny was 23 and had asked facilities if he could upgrade his badge holder to one with a built-in clip camera for personal storage, and facilities had said yes because it was Danny, and he was hard to say no to, and nobody had thought through the implications. She photographed every screen she could reach, 22 frames in 90 seconds. She didn't have time to read what she was photographing. She'd read it later. She closed the panel, left the closet, and was back in the main corridor with her hands at her sides, and her expression carrying nothing in particular when Victor Hale turned the corner 40 feet away. He looked at her. She looked at him. "I was looking for a bathroom," she said. He didn't believe her. She could see that. But he couldn't prove what she'd been doing, not in the time it would take to verify. And what she could see in his face underneath the disbelief was the beginning of something more corrosive. The specific uncertainty that comes when you suspect someone has outmaneuvered you, but you can't identify the mechanism. "Out," he said. "Now, or I call the police and have you removed." She went. Mom. In the parking lot, she sat in her car for 8 minutes with the engine off and her phone in her hands, working through what she'd gotten and what it meant and what she was supposed to do with it. The clinical trial data was worse than she'd thought. Not in volume, she'd expected volume, but in structure. What she'd photographed was organized, meticulous. Someone had been running this for a long time, with enough institutional cover to maintain documentation, which meant it wasn't a rogue operation run by one person. It was a system. It had administrators and support staff, and probably legal counsel somewhere in the chain, and it had been hiding inside Pinecrest Regional because Pinecrest Regional was big enough to provide cover and small enough that no one with oversight authority was paying close attention. The patients. That was what sat in her chest and didn't move. Gerald Wynn had said some of them didn't make it, and she'd kept her face still when he said it because you kept your face still. That was the training. That was what you did. But she was sitting in the parking lot now, and the training had limits. She'd come here to document a fraud, a supply chain fraud, procurement irregularities, the kind of corruption that cost money and eroded institutional trust, and put patients at marginal risk through resource misallocation. That was what the initial intelligence had indicated. The clinical trial data was not a supply chain fraud. She opened the secure messaging app and typed to the contact. Scope is larger than initial assessment, not procurement, medical research, non-consensual, need to talk. The response came in 40 seconds. Calling in 2 minutes. The call came in 90. She answered. "Tell me," said the woman's voice. Emily told her. Concise, ordered, the way she'd been trained to report, facts before interpretation, interpretation before recommendation. It took 4 minutes. When she finished, there was a silence on the other end that lasted long enough to mean something. "That changes the timeline," the woman said. "I know. It also changes the authority structure. This isn't an IG matter anymore. This is..." A pause. "We need to make some calls." "How long?" "Less than 24 hours. Can you stay secure until then?" Emily looked at the hospital entrance. 2 security staff she didn't recognize had appeared at the main doors. Not the usual rotation. New faces. "Define secure," she said. "Not in custody. Not in a situation that generates a record. Working on it." She ended the call and started her car and drove 2 blocks before she noticed the dark SUV that had pulled out of a side street behind her. She spent the next 4 hours moving, not running. Running attracted attention and generated records of its own. Traffic cameras, license plate readers, the kind of digital exhaust that built a narrative even when you were trying not to have one. She drove normally, made normal stops, bought groceries she didn't need from a store on the east side of Raven Falls where she'd never shopped before, and lost the SUV somewhere between the produce section and the parking lot because the store had 2 exits and she'd used the one on the service road. She drove to the apartment of a woman named Kay Stamos, who was 68 and retired from county administration and had no connection to Pinecrest Regional or to anything Emily had ever done professionally. Emily had met her at a laundromat in month 2 of her posting, when they'd ended up at adjacent machines and spent 40 minutes talking about whether Raven Falls had always been this cold in October, or if something had shifted. She'd maintained the friendship carefully, not because she'd been directed to, but because she'd understood early on that 14 months in a small city was a long time to have no one, and the operational requirement to be invisible was different from the practical requirement to not deteriorate. Kay was sharp and funny and knew nothing about Emily's actual life, which made her both safe and genuinely pleasant to be around. She sat at Kay's kitchen table and drank actual good coffee and described the events of the day in terms that were accurate but incomplete. And Kay listened with the focused attention of someone who'd spent 30 years processing other people's problems and said, when Emily finished, "So they fired you for asking questions?" More or less. And then someone had a breakdown and you went back in to help? More or less. And now you think they're going to try to make this your fault? Emily looked at her coffee. That's a reasonable assessment. Kay refilled the cup without being asked. What do you actually need right now? It was a good question, practical, the kind of question Kay always asked, which was why Emily had come here. A few hours, somewhere to think. Then stay. Kay stood up. I'm going to watch something loud in the other room, and you can do whatever you need to do in here. She did. She sat at Kay's kitchen table with the badge camera and photographed each frame more carefully, and she read what she'd captured. And by the time Kay appeared in the doorway 2 hours later to ask if she wanted soup, Emily had a clear enough picture of what had been happening at Pinecrest Regional for the past 3 years that she needed to sit with it for a moment before she could speak normally. She said yes to the soup. The clinical trials had begun as something almost defensible, a private research arrangement between Pinecrest's executive administration and a pharmaceutical contractor whose name appeared in the documentation as Veltris Biomedical. The initial protocol had involved consenting adult patients in a voluntary pain management study. Phase 1 results, according to the documents, had been unremarkable. Phase 2 was where it had gone wrong. Phase 2 had expanded the patient pool to include individuals who were admitted through the ER under specific diagnostic codes that functioned as flags in the administrative system, routing particular patients to the third-floor unit through those pre-signed transfer orders that Emily had started noticing 3 weeks ago. The expanded pool included elderly patients with limited family contact. It included psychiatric holds. It included a category of patient that the documentation referred to as cooperative transfers, in language clinical enough to obscure what it was describing. She'd seen the phrase before, not in a hospital context, in a classified military research file that she'd been allowed to access briefly, years ago, as part of a medical oversight briefing, a file describing what happened when research ethics protocols were circumvented at scale. Cooperative transfers meant patients who couldn't object, who didn't have advocates, who would be unlikely to be missed. 3 years. The documentation covered 3 years. She ate Kay's soup. It was a bean and vegetable situation, thick, slightly oversalted, exactly what you'd expect from someone who cooked the way Kay cooked. She finished it and washed the bowl and put it back in the cabinet. When her phone lit up, it was the secure line. "We have a problem," said the woman's voice, and the register of it was different now, something compressed, the way a voice sounds when it's controlling for something. "Tell me." Veltris Biomedical filed an emergency legal injunction 40 minutes ago. Federal Court, Missoula District. They're claiming the evidence in your transmission was obtained through illegal access to proprietary medical records. The room was quiet. Kay's television murmured from the other end of the apartment. "They know about the transmission," Emily said. "They know something was transmitted. They may not know the contents. They knew fast enough to file in 40 minutes. Yes." Another pause. "They have someone inside our contact chain, Emily. We don't know where yet." She processed that. Someone inside the contact chain. The woman's voice. The encrypted app. The dead drop protocol she'd been running for 14 months. The chain had a breach somewhere in it, which meant the people she'd been reporting to had been partially visible to the people she was investigating, which meant the transfer acceleration wasn't because they suspected me, she said. No. They knew I was reporting out. They've known for some time. Probably. She stood up and walked to Kay's kitchen window and looked at the street. A quiet residential block. Older houses, a few with porch lights already on against the early March dark. Nothing that looked wrong. "The injunction creates a problem," she said. "If the evidence is legally challenged before it can be submitted, it creates a gap. Yes, which is why I need you to listen carefully." The woman's voice dropped another register. "The drive you sent, it's the primary record. But you said you have photographs from the administrative panel. 22 frames. That's secondary documentation, taken after your termination while in the facility without authorization. A competent attorney will argue it's inadmissible, which means the injunction and the unauthorized access combine to create a window. A window for them to move everything else. The loading bay has been active for the past 3 hours. They know they have a window and they're using it. Emily looked at the clock on Kay's microwave. It was 7:41 p.m. The hospital's administrative offices closed at 5. The executive team would have been briefed on the injunction, and they'd know that the federal authorization for a search warrant would take until at least tomorrow morning, which gave them the night. "I need to get back in there," she said. "Emily, not to document. That window's closing anyway. I need the physical records." She remembered Gerald Wynn's hands, the trembling that came from something older than fear. "I have records going back 2 years." Wynn has something physical, something he was trying to protect. They admitted him as a patient, which means his personal effects are in the secure property locker, Bay 8 property intake. "If you go back in there, I know." Hale has 2 additional security staff on the building, and he's been in contact with the county sheriff's office. "If you're caught inside, I know what it means." She turned from the window. "What I need from you is a 20-minute window, something that pulls Hale's attention to the opposite end of the building." A long silence. "I can generate a fire system test request through the facilities channel," the woman said finally. "It won't hold long. 20 minutes is enough." "Emily, if this doesn't work, we lose everything. The chain breach, the injunction, the unauthorized documentation, you become the story, not them." She understood that. She'd understood it from the moment she'd gotten out of her car in the hospital parking lot that afternoon, knowing she'd been told to stand by and going in anyway. Some choices didn't have clean justifications. They just had the weight of what happened if you didn't make them. "Make the call," she said. "I'll be in position in 30 minutes. She hung up before the woman could argue further. She went to Kay's living room doorway. Kay looked up from the television. "I have to go do something," Emily said. Kay looked at her for a moment with the expression of someone who understood more than she was being told. "Will you be okay?" "I'll let you know," Emily said, which was honest. Sick. She parked 2 streets from the hospital and went in through the ambulance bay, which was the one entrance that couldn't be keycard restricted without creating an unacceptable patient access delay. She'd known that since month 3. The bay was busy enough at 8:22 p.m. that her scrubs, she'd changed in Kay's bathroom, pulling the set she kept in her car bag for overnight emergencies, didn't draw immediate attention. The fire system test initiated at 8:24. She heard the alert chime cascade through the building's PA, the recorded voice announcing a scheduled system check in the West Wing, and she saw the 2 additional security staff on the East Corridor pivot and move west because that was procedure, and they were new enough that procedure was what they followed. She moved. The property intake locker for Bay 8 was in the secure patient belongings room off the main nursing station, behind a door that opened with any staff keycard. She had Danny Okafor's badge, which she'd never given back because the handoff in the chaos had gotten complicated and nobody had asked. She used it. The door opened. Gerald Wynn's property bag was in slot 14. She found it in 40 seconds. Inside was what you'd expect: clothes, a wallet, a phone that had been locked and powered down, and underneath the folded shirt, a water-resistant document pouch, the kind that cost $12 at any outdoor supply store. The kind you took on a hike if you wanted to keep something dry. Inside that, a USB drive and a folded paper, handwritten, 4 pages dense with dates and names and dosages and patient ID numbers. Her hands weren't completely steady when she put it in her pocket. She noticed that and didn't try to fix it. She was out of the belongings room, door closed behind her, moving back toward the ambulance bay when the fire system test ended and the lights in the East Corridor went back to standard operation, and Victor Hale came around the corner 20 feet ahead of her. He had one of the additional security officers with him. He looked at Emily. He looked at what she was carrying, which was nothing visible, nothing incriminating, just her hands and her scrubs and her face. His own face went through something. Confirmation, maybe. The satisfaction of a suspicion resolved. "Get the sheriff on the line," he said to the officer beside him, without looking at him. His eyes stayed on Emily. "Tell them I need someone here now." Emily stood in the middle of the corridor. "Put your hands where I can see them," Hale said. She put her hands up. She had the document pouch in her left scrub pocket. She had 22 photographs on Danny's badge camera. She had an encrypted transmission that was currently the subject of a federal injunction and a contact chain with a breach she couldn't identify. She was standing in a hospital corridor at 8:30 at night with her hands in the air and Victor Hale walking toward her with his face doing the thing it did when he thought he'd already won. Her phone, in her right pocket, buzzed once. She couldn't check it. Her hands were up. It buzzed again. Then a third time, fast, the pattern that meant urgent contact from the secure line. Hale was 10 feet away. She looked at him and kept her hands still, and whatever was happening on that phone, whatever the message was, it was going to have to wait. Hale closed the last 5 feet slowly, the way people move when they want you to feel the weight of what's coming. He'd done this before. Emily could see it in the economy of the gesture, the unhurried quality of someone who believed the outcome was already settled. "You're trespassing," he said, "and whatever you took out of that room is stolen property." "I don't have anything." "We'll see." He nodded to the officer. "Pat her down." The officer, young, maybe 25, the uncomfortable kind of young where he clearly hadn't signed up for this specific situation, moved toward her left side. Emily kept her hands up and kept her eyes on Hale and ran the math in her head. The document pouch was in her left pocket. If the officer did a proper search, he'd find it in 4 seconds. The badge camera with 22 photographs was clipped to her right pocket. That one he'd see before he even touched her. She had nothing, except her phone was still buzzing. 3 more pulses, then a pause, then 3 more. Not the urgent pattern now, something else. A rhythm she hadn't used in years that she wouldn't have recognized unless she'd once spent 8 weeks memorizing communication protocols in a basement in Fort Bragg. It meant, stand down, we are on site. The officer's hand reached her left side. The ambulance bay doors at the end of the corridor blew open. Not an ambulance. 4 people moving fast in civilian clothes with federal identification already raised, and behind them, filling the doorway with the particular authority of institutional mass, 2 figures in military service uniforms that did not belong in a Montana hospital corridor on a Tuesday night. The officer's hand stopped. He took a step back from Emily. Hale turned. The lead federal agent was a woman, mid-40s, dark coat, the kind of face that had learned to convey exactly as much as it intended to, and nothing more. She held her credentials up long enough for Hale to read them and then put them away. "Victor Hale. I'm Special Agent Don O'Rourke, DOJ Office of Inspector General. This facility is now under federal investigation. I need you to step back from that individual." Hale didn't move immediately. That 1 second of hesitation was its own kind of confession. "She's trespassing," he said. "She was terminated this morning and she broke back into some—" "Step back, Mr. Hale." He stepped back. The second military figure came forward. A man, 50 or so, the kind of build that was no longer athletic but had a memory of it in the way he carried himself. He wore a colonel's insignia. Emily didn't recognize his face, but she recognized the unit patch on his shoulder, and something in her chest did a complicated thing that she didn't have time to process. He walked past Don O'Rourke. He walked past Victor Hale. He stopped in front of Emily with her hand still raised, and he looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't immediately categorize. Not quite professional, not quite personal, something that sat in the overlap. He brought his hand up in a salute. "Captain Brooks," he said, "thank you for completing the mission." The corridor was quiet enough that she could hear the ventilation system cycling. She lowered her hands. Behind the colonel, she could see Victor Hale's face running through a sequence of expressions. Confusion, calculation, the specific kind of comprehension that arrives too late to be useful. The security officer beside him had taken another step back and was looking at his own shoes. Emily didn't salute back. She wasn't in uniform. She wasn't active. But she held the colonel's gaze and said, "The loading bay. They've been running vehicles out for 3 hours." "We have it." He turned to one of the agents behind him. "Loading bay is locked down?" "Since 8:15, the agent said. She'd been in the property room at 8:22, which meant the lockdown had been in place before she'd gone in, which meant the fire system distraction had been coordinated with the federal response, not separately from it. The woman on the phone had been buying time for both of them simultaneously. She filed that away. "I need to give you something," Emily said to Rourke. She reached into her left pocket slowly, deliberately, and produced the document pouch. She set it on the nurse's station counter between them. Then she unclipped Danny's badge from her right pocket and set it beside the pouch. 22 photographs of administrative files from the East Wing server panel, taken approximately 90 minutes ago. She looked at Rourke directly. I know the chain of custody is compromised. I know the injunction creates problems. But the paper record in that pouch and the drive inside it predate anything I touched tonight. They were in Gerald Wynn's personal property, and Gerald Wynn can testify to their origin. Rourke picked up the pouch without opening it. Where is Wynn now? Hale's security detained him. I don't know where in the building. Rourke turned to Hale. Mr. Wynn's location. Hale said nothing. Mr. Hale, that's not a request. Something moved through his face. The calculation Emily had seen earlier had completed its cycle and arrived somewhere he hadn't expected, and the man she'd watched operate with institutional confidence for 14 months looked, for the first time, like someone who understood the dimensions of the room he was actually standing in. Third floor, he said. Observation room 3. They moved as a group, Rourke, the colonel, 2 agents, Emily, because nobody told her to stop and she wasn't stopping, through the east corridor and up the stairwell to the 3rd floor. Emily had been on the 3rd floor twice in 14 months, both times briefly, and both times she'd felt the quality of wrong that a place has when its surface and its function have diverged too far. The 3rd floor was quiet. Most of the clinical staff had been sequestered in the main nursing station at Rourke's direction. 3 doors down from the nursing station, an agent she didn't know was standing outside a room. And inside that room, Gerald Wynn was sitting on a hospital bed in a gown, not restrained but clearly not free, with a Pinecrest security officer in the corner who straightened when the group entered and then looked at the federal credentials and sat back down in the specific way of someone who had decided very quickly that he had made different choices than his employer. Wynn looked at Emily. His face did something complicated. I told you, he said. You did, she agreed. Rourke introduced herself and the agents and explained to Wynn that he was not under detention, that he was a witness, that anything he said to federal investigators was protected. Wynn listened to all of this with the careful attention of someone who had learned not to trust explanations until they were finished. The drive, he said. In my property. We have it, Rourke said. 2 years. He looked at his hands, which were steadier now than they'd been in Bay 8. I was a clinical coordinator for Veltris. I came on to Pinecrest 3 years ago to facilitate the research arrangement. The first year I thought it was... He stopped. I thought the consent documentation was being handled by someone else, structured that way on purpose. His jaw tightened. By year 2 I knew it wasn't. Why didn't you report it then? He looked at her. It was not an uncomplicated look. Because 2 of the patients whose files I was managing had family members who'd been asking questions, and both of them stopped asking. The room was quiet. I can't tell you what happened to those family members, Wynn said. I don't know. I know they stopped. And I know that after they stopped, the 3rd floor protocol expanded. He turned to Emily. The weapon. I took it from the security office. I didn't plan to use it. I just needed... He shook his head. I needed someone to stop long enough to listen. We're listening now, Emily said. The next 2 hours were controlled chaos of the institutional kind. Federal agents working through the building in organized teams, IT forensics on the 3rd floor servers, a second team on the administrative offices where the Veltris documentation had been accessed and partially deleted in the 30 minutes between the injunction filing and the federal response reaching the building. Partially deleted because 3 years of data doesn't disappear in 30 minutes, and because Veltris's own documentation protocols had created redundancies that now existed as evidence. Emily sat in the main corridor outside the nursing station and watched it happen. Someone brought her a cup of coffee at some point, one of the junior agents, a small gesture of the kind that happens in the margins of large events, and she drank it and watched people move through the building with the focused efficiency of an operation that had been waiting for authorization. The colonel found her at some point past 10. He sat down in the chair beside her, which surprised her, and for a moment he didn't say anything, just looked at the activity in the corridor. You were supposed to call the contact window, he said finally. The timeline moved. You went in twice after your access was revoked. Yes. He was quiet for a moment. The injunction is being contested. Rourke's team had a counter-argument prepared before Veltris filed, which tells you something about how long we've been watching Veltris's legal team. He turned to look at her. The chain breach. Do you want to know? Yes. Administrative level. Someone in the hospital's compliance office who'd been feeding Veltris information about the investigation's proximity. Not someone in our chain. We think the compliance officer had an independent line to Veltris Legal that we weren't aware of. A pause. It means they knew you were watching. They didn't know the full scope of what you had. They knew enough to accelerate the loading bay timeline. Yes, but not enough to move the data. He looked back at the corridor. The data is the case, Emily. Without the data, Wynn's testimony and your documentation is compelling but contestable. With the data, it's done. She thought about the third-floor server room, where an IT forensics team was working through material that, if the documents she'd photographed were representative, contained 3 years of evidence about what had been done to patients in a hospital in a small Montana city where nobody with authority had been paying close enough attention. How many patients? She asked. He didn't answer right away. We don't have a full count yet. That wasn't a no. She let it sit. At 10:47 p.m., Victor Hale was escorted out of the hospital's administrative suite by 2 agents. He was not in handcuffs, that would come later, with the paperwork that made things formal, but he walked between them with the gait of someone who had aged a decade in 4 hours, and when he passed the nursing station where Emily was sitting, he looked at her. You set me up, he said. She looked back at him. No, you exposed yourself. He had nothing for that. The agents kept him moving. At 11:15, her phone buzzed with a text from Danny Okafor. Is everyone okay in there? She typed back, yes, you can go home, Danny. A pause. Then, my badge? She looked at the counter where she'd set it during the handoff. It had already been collected as evidence. She typed, evidence, hospital, will replace it. A longer pause. Then, okay, Emily. You okay? She looked at the corridor, at the federal agents and the hospital staff sequestered in small groups, at the third-floor stairwell where someone was carrying equipment cases out that were not olive drab, that were the hard-shell black of forensic collection. Yeah, she typed. I'm okay. She wasn't entirely sure that was true, but it was true enough for a text message. At midnight, Rourke found her in the same corridor with a different cup of coffee, this one cold, and sat down with the manner of someone who had taken a breath for the first time in several hours. We're going to need your formal statement, she said. Not tonight. Tomorrow, after you've slept. I know the process. I know you do. Rourke looked at her. She was the kind of person who looked directly at you when she wanted to say something and wasn't sure how. The injunction is going to be a fight. Veltris has resources and they're going to use them. The chain of custody on some of your evidence is going to be challenged. I know. What you got from the server panel tonight, the photographs, we may not be able to use them directly, but what they show us told us where to look in the data we do have clean access to, and we found it. She paused. So, in terms of outcome, what you did tonight mattered. In terms of what it cost you personally, she stopped. What it cost me, Emily said, is a job I was planning to leave anyway. Rourke almost smiled. There's going to be significant attention on this. The trial, when it happens. Your name, your real name, will probably become part of the public record. Emily thought about that. She'd spent 3 years building a life under Emily Brooks. A lease, a library card, a friendship with a 68-year-old woman who oversalted her soup and didn't ask the right questions, a dog who recognized her in a kennel. Can I ask you something? She said. Sure. Recon, the K9, what happens to him? Rourke looked at her for a moment like she was recalibrating something. The security program is going to be restructured under new hospital leadership. The dog's placement will be... She paused. I honestly don't know. Emily nodded. At 12:40 a.m., a second federal vehicle pulled into the hospital's main entrance. Emily was near the lobby windows, and she saw it arrive, saw the occupants get out. 2 more agents and a woman in a tailored coat who carried herself with the specific weight of someone whose decisions moved large things. The colonel intercepted the woman in the lobby. They spoke for 3 minutes in the kind of low-register conversation that happens between people with serious authority about serious matters. Then the colonel turned and found Emily across the lobby. He said something to the woman in the coat. The woman looked at Emily. Then she walked toward her with the focused intention of someone who has come somewhere specifically to see one person. She stopped in front of Emily and looked at her for a moment, and Emily had the distinct and disorienting sensation of being assessed by someone who already knew the results. "Captain Brooks," the woman said. Her voice was the one from the phone. "I owe you an apology." Emily looked at her. "For what?" "For the 24-hour timeline. I told you to stand by." A pause. "You were right not to." Emily didn't say anything. The woman's face was the face of someone who'd been doing this work long enough to have made all the calculations Emily had made and to understand which ones required apology and which ones just required acknowledgement. "There's something else," the woman said. "Something that didn't come from the server data." She handed Emily a single sheet of paper. Printed, not handwritten. A list of 12 names. "Those are patient families," the woman said. "The ones we know of. The ones who started asking questions and stopped." Emily looked at the list. 12 names. She thought of what Wynne had said. Both of them stopped. "Are they—" "7 we've located. They're safe. They were pressured, some of them financially, some of them through other means. They stopped asking because they were made to be afraid to keep asking." A pause. 5 we haven't found yet." Emily looked at the list again. 12 families, 7 accounted for, 5 missing. "Where do you think the 5 are?" she asked, though she had a direction already forming in her head, built from the billing codes and the transfer patterns and the specific geography of what she'd seen on that server panel. The woman in the coat looked at her steadily. "That's what I came here to talk to you about. That's what I came here to talk to you about." The woman's name was Patricia Voss. She told Emily that on the way to the conference room on the second floor, which was now functioning as a temporary operations center, its long table covered with laptops and document binders, and the particular organized disorder of a federal investigation running at speed in an unfamiliar space. Voss was the regional director of a joint oversight unit that Emily had known existed and had never expected to meet in person, because the people at that level of the chain didn't typically come to the site. They received reports. They made decisions at distance. The fact that Voss had driven to Raven Falls at midnight told Emily the 5 missing names were not a peripheral problem. They sat at the far end of the conference table, away from the active workstations, and Voss laid out what they had in the flat, methodical way of someone delivering a briefing rather than a conversation. The 5 families had been identified through cross-referencing hospital billing records with Veltris Biomedical's internal communications. Communications that existed because Veltris's legal team had made the catastrophic mistake of storing sensitive correspondence on a server that was technically co-administered by Pinecrest's IT department, which meant the federal warrant covering the hospital had swept them up clean, no secondary filing required. That was the kind of mistake that happened when organizations believed they were too embedded to be touched. They got sloppy at the infrastructure level. The 5 families made contact with patient advocacy organizations, Voss said. 2 of them contacted a state licensing board. 1 contacted a journalist in Missoula. She paused. The journalist is fine. The story was killed at the editorial level through means we're still characterizing. The families were each approached by individuals presenting as hospital patient relations staff offering settlements. Settlements with NDAs. Correct. But 3 of the 5 families declined the settlements, at which point the contact shifted. She looked at Emily steadily. The families who declined were then subject to what we're characterizing as coordinated pressure. Financial in some cases. In 2 cases, more direct. What does more direct mean? 1 family had a child in a Raven Falls school. There were incidents at the school. Harassment. Property damage. The family relocated to Idaho 6 months ago. She set down the page she was holding. The other family, a woman named Darlene Fossey, whose husband was a 3rd-floor patient in year 2 of the protocol. She filed a formal complaint with the state medical board and then withdrew it 10 days later. She's been unreachable since February. Emily kept her face neutral. February is 6 weeks ago. Yes. And the 2 families who took the settlements. We've located them. They're cooperative. The NDA won't hold under federal investigation. They know that, and they're willing to talk. Voss leaned forward slightly. The issue is Darlene Foss. If she filed and withdrew under pressure, and if she's been unreachable since February, she either left voluntarily and doesn't want to be found, or someone made sure she wouldn't be found. Given the pattern, we need to know which one. And you're telling me this because… Voss was quiet for a moment. Because you have 14 months of on-ground knowledge of this community that my agents don't have. Because Fosse's husband was admitted to this hospital on the same administrative track as the other protocol patients, which means his file is in the records we're processing, which means there may be information in those files about Fosse herself that our IT team would benefit from knowing how to interpret. She paused. And because the person who was running ground-level surveillance on the advocacy organizations and the families was not a Veltris employee. He was Pinecrest security staff. Emily looked at her. Victor Hale, Voss said. What? It was 1:15 a.m. by the time Emily was sitting across from Hale in what had been, 4 hours earlier, the hospital's administrative conference room, and was now something functionally different. 2 federal agents behind Voss, the colonel standing near the door, and Hale on the other side of the table with the attorney he'd called in the last hour, a man named Greer, who had the practiced expression of someone managing a situation he hadn't expected to be managing tonight. Hale had said very little since the corridor. He'd watched the building get processed, watched his staff get separated and interviewed, watched the loading bay get locked down with vehicles still backed up to the doors. He'd watched all of it with the particular stillness of someone who is doing complex arithmetic and doesn't like any of the answers. Greer had advised him not to speak. Hale was not speaking. Voss put a photograph on the table. A woman, mid-50s, dark coat, standing outside what looked like a county building. The photograph had a date stamp in the corner. Darlene Fosse, Voss said. Can you tell me the last time you had contact with her? Greer said, Mr. Hale isn't going to… I'm not asking about the investigation, Voss said. I'm asking a factual question about a missing person. She let that phrase sit on the table alongside the photograph. When did you last have contact with Darlene Foss? Hale looked at the photograph. Something moved in his face that wasn't quite recognition and wasn't quite the absence of it. I don't know who that is, he said. That's interesting, Emily said from her seat to Voss's left. Because your security staff keycard shows access to the 3rd floor administrative office on the same date Fosse's medical board complaint was withdrawn. And the IP address that submitted the withdrawal form online matches a terminal in the hospital security suite. Greer put his hand on Hale's arm. Hale looked at Emily. You've been very busy, he said. I'm a nurse, she said. We document things. It wasn't quite true. The IP correlation had come from Rourke's IT team in the last hour, not from anything Emily had documented herself, but the distinction didn't need to be spelled out. Hale sat back. He looked at the ceiling, a gesture that looked like consideration, but was probably calculation, the same calculation he'd been running since the ambulance bay doors opened. He'd had 2 hours to run it. He'd arrived somewhere. I need to speak with my attorney, he said. Privately. Voss nodded. She stood, and the agents and Emily and the colonel filed out, and they stood in the corridor for 12 minutes while behind the conference room door, presumably, Victor Hale was being told something by his attorney about the specific mathematics of cooperation. Emily stood near the window at the end of the corridor. The parking lot below was still active, federal vehicles, 2 county sheriff's units that had arrived after midnight, a news van that had appeared in the last hour from the Missoula affiliate and was parked at the edge of the lot, unable to get past the barrier the agents had established. Someone had called someone. That was how it went. The colonel stood near her. You should sleep at some point, he said. I'm aware. That wasn't a recommendation. It was an observation. He was quiet for a moment. Hale's going to give them something. I know. The question is whether it's enough about Fosse. Yes. She looked at the news van. Who called the press? It wasn't us. She thought about that. The hospital had administrative staff, nursing staff, security staff. Any one of them could have made a call. In fact, in a building this size, it would have been surprising if no one had. How much do they know? She asked. Enough to be here. Not enough to report anything specific. He looked at the van. That's going to change in the next 48 hours. She understood what he meant. The injunction, the federal warrant, the arrests that were coming. These were not things that stayed quiet. Raven Falls was 60,000 people. Pinecrest Regional was the largest employer in the county. When this broke publicly, it was going to break large. And in the breaking, her name, both of her names, was going to be part of it. She'd understood that when she'd gotten out of the car that afternoon. She'd made the choice anyway. That didn't mean it felt simple. The conference room door opened. Greer appeared, and behind him Hale, and the expression on Hale's face was the expression of a man who had done the math and not liked it, and decided to stop pretending he could change the outcome. "He'll tell you where Fosse is," Greer said. Darlene Foss was in a residential facility 40 miles outside Raven Falls, in a town called Millhaven that barely qualified as a town, a main road, a gas station, a grain elevator, and a cluster of houses that had been built in the 70s and were showing it. The facility was licensed as an assisted living center. Its ownership structure, when the IT team ran it at 2 a.m. while Emily and Rourke were in a federal vehicle driving through the dark Montana highway, connected back through 3 holding companies to a real estate entity that also appeared in Veltris Biomedical's financial documentation. "They parked her there," Rourke said from the passenger seat. "How long?" Hale said 6 weeks, consistent with February. "She's been there voluntarily?" Rourke didn't answer right away. Hale says she was told that if she stayed quiet and stayed away from Raven Falls, her husband's estate claim would be settled. She's been waiting for paperwork that was never going to come. Emily looked at the highway. It was the kind of flat dark that exists outside small cities in the Mountain West. The kind where your headlights seem to extend forever without illuminating anything useful. "She's not a prisoner," she said. "She can leave." "She doesn't know what she doesn't know," Rourke said. "Nobody told her the investigation had reached the hospital. Nobody told her anything since February, by design." They reached Millhaven at 2:40 a.m. The facility was a converted farmhouse with 2 outbuildings, low lit, the kind of place that looked peaceful at a distance and bureaucratic up close. A night staff member answered the door in the particular confused alarm of someone woken at an unusual hour by federal credentials, and Rourke handled it with the practiced efficiency of someone who had delivered news in the middle of the night before. Darlene Foss was in a room on the 2nd floor. She was awake, had been awake apparently because she wasn't sleeping well and hadn't been for weeks, and she opened the door to her room in a bathrobe with the wary expression of someone who had learned that unexpected visits meant bad things. She was 57, shorter than Emily had expected from the photograph, with the specific exhaustion of someone who'd been waiting a long time for something that wasn't coming. Rourke explained the investigation in careful increments, who they were, what they'd found, what it meant for the people responsible. Fosse listened without interrupting, which took a kind of discipline Emily recognized. When Rourke finished, Fosse was quiet for a moment. "My husband's records," she said. "You have them." "Yes." "And the consent forms, the ones they said he signed." "We have those too." "He had macular degeneration. Advanced. He couldn't read without his glasses, and they kept his glasses during the intake." She said it flat, without inflection, the way you say things you've said to yourself so many times they've worn smooth. "I told the board that. That was in my complaint before I withdrew it." Emily, standing near the door, said nothing. She watched Darlene Foss's face and understood that some things couldn't be fixed by the presence of federal agents at 2:40 in the morning, that the weight of what had happened here was going to require more than an investigation to actually move, and that the best she could offer right now was to not fill the room with words it didn't need. "Will you come back with us?" Rourke asked. Fosse looked at her. "To Raven Falls?" "To wherever you need to go, but we'll need your formal statement." Fosse looked out the window at the dark. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she stood up and started putting things in a bag with the efficiency of someone who hadn't fully unpacked, who'd been treating 6 weeks as temporary even when she hadn't been sure it was. Botsen. By 4 a.m., the conference room at Pinecrest Regional had become a documentation center. The IT forensics team had pulled everything from the 3rd-floor servers that was pullable, and what they had was, in the phrase Rourke used when she briefed the assembled agents at the long table, comprehensive in ways that will make prosecution straightforward. 3 years of clinical protocol data, patient intake records, Veltris Biomedical's internal communications about the Pinecrest arrangement, including emails between Veltris's medical director, a man named Aldous Price, who is currently unreachable and whose travel records showed a flight out of Missoula that morning before the federal warrant had been issued, and Pinecrest's CFO, whose name was Gordon Tate, and who had been in the building until midnight and was currently in a county vehicle. Tate had not gone quietly. That was the word Emily got secondhand from one of the agents, who described the CFO's exit from the building in the terms of someone who'd watched a confident man's vocabulary shrink from institutional authority to profanity to silence in the span of about 12 minutes. The CFO was 54, had been at Pinecrest for 11 years, and had the financial fingerprints of the arrangement embedded in billing structures that looked, on surface audit, like administrative overhead reallocation. It took a forensic accountant to see what it actually was. Voss's team had a forensic accountant. She'd been working the billing structure since 3 a.m. with the focused energy of someone who liked finding things people had tried to hide. Tate was the architecture, the forensic accountant, whose name was Petra Salas, told Emily over bad conference room coffee at 4:30. She was maybe 35, had a purple pen behind her ear, and spoke about financial fraud with the matter-of-fact enthusiasm of someone who found it genuinely interesting. The Veltris payments came in as research consulting fees, completely normal line item in hospital billing, especially for facilities with academic affiliations. Except Pinecrest doesn't have academic affiliations. Someone just made it look like it did. And the payments out? To a series of vendors that don't exist, or exist on paper. Petra tapped her laptop. Shell companies registered in 3 different states. Ultimately, the money goes to a trust structure that benefits, and this is the part I enjoy, Tate's brother-in-law in Nevada. She sipped her coffee. People think they're being clever with money, and then they do something like that. Emily looked at the spreadsheet on Petra's screen. 3 years of payments. She did the math on what she could read. The number was large enough that she stopped doing the math and looked away. How much of it is recoverable? She asked. Some. The shell companies still hold assets. The Nevada Trust is going to be contested. Petra shrugged. It's never as much as you want, but the criminal exposure, that's clean. That's not going to be contested. At 6 a.m., when the Montana sky was doing the thing it did in early March, where the dark lifts slowly and reveals a gray that's almost the same shade as the dark. Just with more visibility, Emily walked out of the hospital's main entrance and stood in the cold for a while. The news van was still there. There were 2 of them now. Someone was doing a stand-up near the parking lot barrier, talking into a camera with the hospital building behind them. Emily couldn't hear what they were saying. She didn't particularly want to. She was tired in the specific way that comes after sustained high-alert functioning, not sleepy exactly, but hollowed, the way a room feels after everyone leaves a party. The work was mostly done, and what was left was the institutional machinery taking over, which was appropriate and correct, and left her standing in a parking lot at 6 a.m. without a clear function. Her phone had 19 messages she hadn't read. Some from numbers she recognized, some she didn't. She scrolled through them without opening most of them. There was one from Kay Stamos that said only, "I saw the news." "Are you all right?" Sent at 5:15 a.m., which meant Kay had been up at 5:15 a.m. watching local news, which was very Kay. She texted back, "I'm all right, thank you for the soup." She was standing there looking at the sky when she heard the doors open behind her and turned to see the colonel. He handed her a coffee he'd gotten from somewhere. It was in a real mug, not a paper cup, which meant he'd gotten it from the break room rather than the machine, which meant someone had made a pot sometime in the last hour. She took it. "Price is in the wind," he said. "The Veltris medical director. Flight out of Missoula yesterday morning. We have Interpol notification." "Will they find him?" "Probably. He's not sophisticated about travel." He looked at the news vans. "The other thing. Hale's cooperation. It's substantial. He's given us 3 names we didn't have in the Veltris structure. An individual in state licensing who was receiving payments to suppress complaints, and the name of the attorney who drafted the NDA settlements. The attorney who killed the Missoula story. That's less clear, but it's being looked at." He sipped his own coffee. "Hale is going to prison. The cooperation reduces his exposure, but it doesn't change the fundamental outcome. I know. He understands that too, which is probably why he's being cooperative. He was quiet for a moment. People make different decisions when they understand the ceiling. Emily looked at the hospital building. 14 months she'd walked in and out of those doors. She knew every entrance, every system quirk, every staff member by their habits and their shifts. She knew the generator hesitated 2 seconds late, and the supply closet on the east corridor had a maintenance panel with a 6-digit code on a sticker. She knew Recon pressed his flank against your leg if he trusted you. She thought about what she was going to do now. The mission was complete. More than complete. It had expanded into something larger than the initial scope, which was not unusual and which was, in its way, the answer to the question of why this kind of work was worth doing. You came in to find procurement fraud, and you found 3 years of unconsented medical research, and 5 displaced families, and 1 woman waiting in a converted farmhouse for paperwork that was never coming. You found what was actually there, not just what you'd been sent to look for. She didn't know what came after this for her. She'd think about that when she'd slept. "There's something else," the colonel said. She looked at him. Veltris Biomedical's research protocol. The expanded patient pool, the one that used the third-floor administrative track. He set down his coffee. "The data we pulled from the servers includes outcome records, every patient who went through the protocol." She waited. 41 patients over 3 years. 36 are alive and have been located. Their families were not notified about the trials. Many of them don't know what was done to their family members during those admissions. He paused. 3 patients died during the protocol period. The death records list standard causes: cardiac, respiratory. We're opening those records. 3 patients. She'd known it was coming, had known since Gerald Wynn said some of them didn't make it, but knowing and hearing the number were different. "And the other 2?" she asked, because 41 minus 36 minus 3 was 2. "One is Gerald Wynn. We know where he is." A pause. "The other is a patient who was transferred out of Pinecrest 9 months ago to a long-term care facility in Billings. The transfer was documented. The patient arrived. 2 months later, the patient's file shows a discharge, but there's no record of where the patient went after discharge, and the family has not heard from them." Emily was quiet. "That's case number 41, the colonel said, "and it's the one that currently has no resolution." She thought about the list of 12 names, 7 located, 5 initially missing, Fossey accounted for, the school families, the settlement families. "The Billings transfer," she said. "Who authorized it?" "Tate, CFO sign-off, administrative track." "Who received the patient at the Billings facility?" "That's what we're working on." She looked at the hospital, then at the news vans, then at the gray Montana morning that was slowly becoming something with more color in it. "I need to make a call," she said. "Emily, not operational, personal." She looked at him. "I have a contact in Billings, former colleague. She works long-term care, and she knows that system better than anyone you're going to find in the next 12 hours. She paused. "Let me make the call." He looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded. She stepped away from the entrance and pulled up a number she hadn't dialed in 2 years. It rang 4 times. A woman answered, voice rough with early morning, and Emily said, "Margot? It's Emily Calvert. I need a favor, and I need it right now." A pause. Then, "It's 6 a.m. "I know. I'm sorry." "You're not sorry, or you'd have called at 7. But the voice had shifted into something more alert, the way medical people shift when they understand there's an actual situation. "What do you need?" Emily told her. Patient name, approximate transfer date, the Billings facility name. She heard Margot writing things down, the scratch of pen on paper, and then a pause. "I know that facility," Margot said. "I did a consult there 18 months ago. It's—" She stopped. "Emily, that facility had a fire. Last November, East Wing." Emily stood still. "Records were damaged," Margot said. "Some patients were relocated. There was a temporary situation with bed availability across 3 different centers." A pause. "I remember because the relocation documentation was a mess. Nobody knew which records had survived and which hadn't. Can you find out which patients were relocated and where they went?" "I can try. It'll take me a few hours. Call me the second you have anything. She ended the call and stood in the cold for a moment. A fire in November. Records damaged. One unaccounted patient transferred out of Pinecrest 9 months ago on an administrative track authorized by a CFO who is currently in a county vehicle. She went back inside. Rourke was in the corridor near the operations center talking to one of her agents, and she looked up when Emily came in. The Billings facility had a fire, Emily said, last November. Records were damaged. Your IT team needs to look for what Veltris was doing with their own documentation around that date, because if there's a patient unaccounted for and that fire wasn't accidental, Rourke's face changed. Not dramatically, just a slight compression around the eyes that meant she was running the same calculation Emily was running and arriving at the same place. Petra, she called across the room. Petra Salas looked up. Veltris financial activity, October through December of last year. I need to know if there are any payments to contractors in Billings, Montana. Any category. Petra was already typing. Emily stood in the center of the room and watched the investigation shift into a new gear around her, and she thought about case number 41. And she thought about what kind of organization burns its own paper trail. And she thought about the fact that in 3 years of meticulous record-keeping, Veltris Biomedical had kept documentation on every patient, every protocol, every payment, except one. Petra said from her workstation, I have something. Everyone in the room stopped. October. Veltris made a payment to a property management company in Billings, $42,000, listed as facility consulting. She looked up. The property management company owns the building that houses the long-term care facility. The room was quiet. They didn't just transfer the patient, Emily said. Rourke looked at her. They own the facility, Emily said, or part of it, which means the patient wasn't relocated after the fire. The fire was... She stopped. Margot said the documentation was a mess. Nobody knew which records had survived. Rourke said, because the records were supposed to be gone. But the patient may still be there. Rourke was already reaching for her phone, or may have been moved to one of the 3 relocation facilities. She looked at Emily directly. Which 3? Emily called Margot back. Margot had been doing her own digging in the 20 minutes since they'd spoken, because Margot was that kind of person, and she read Emily 3 facility names and addresses without being asked for them. Emily read them to Rourke. Rourke was giving directions to her agents before Emily finished the last address. At 6:52 a.m., 3 separate federal vehicles left Pinecrest Regional's parking lot, heading in different directions. Emily watched them go from the lobby window. Voss appeared beside her. She'd been in the building since midnight and looked like it, but her expression was the focused expression of someone operating well past the point where tiredness was relevant. The Veltris medical director, Voss said. Price. Before he left the country, he was in contact with someone in this hospital as recently as yesterday morning. Who? Not Hale, not Tate. She paused. The hospital's medical director, Dr. Marcus Flint. Emily stood very still. Flint. The attending who'd looked at her like she'd personally cut the power on her first week, who'd pre-signed transfer orders, who'd been the attending signature on Gerald Wynn's intake forms. He's still in the building, Voss said. Emily looked at her. He came in for his shift at 6, standard schedule. He doesn't know yet that his communications with Price are in the data. Voss looked at Emily with an expression that was almost careful. I wanted you to know before we went and got him. She wanted to understand what it meant that Flint had been in communication with Price the morning after Emily had sent her encrypted transmission, the morning that the transfer acceleration had begun, the morning the loading bay had started running vehicles. Flint hadn't just been the attending on the protocol patients. He'd been the early warning system. When Emily started pulling transfer logs, someone had told Price, not Hale, who hadn't known about the transmission chain, not Tate, who operated at the financial level. Flint, who'd been watching her work at her station and hadn't needed to monitor her remotely because he'd been in the ER with her. He was watching me from the beginning, she said. Appears so. She thought about 14 months of double shifts, of Donna Price's scheduling, of every time Flint had looked at her like she was a problem and she'd assumed it was professional condescension. It had been something more specific than condescension. He'd been watching her the way you watch something that might eventually become dangerous. "Where is he now?" she asked. "Bay 4, Voss said. "His usual rounds." Emily looked at the corridor that led to the ER. She thought about Gerald Wynne in Bay 8 with his hand shaking and the weight of 2 years of knowledge he hadn't been able to put down. She thought about Darlene Fossey in a converted farmhouse waiting for paperwork that was a fiction. She thought about 3 dead patients whose death records listed standard causes. "Do you want me there?" she asked. Voss considered. "That depends on what you want out of it." "Nothing," Emily said. It was mostly true. "I just want to see his face when he understands it's over." They walked toward the ER together, and behind them in the conference room, Petra Salas was running Veltris financial records against a property database, and in 3 different directions, federal vehicles were approaching long-term care facilities in Billings, and somewhere in a county vehicle, Gordon Tate was being advised by his attorney about the dimensions of the ceiling he'd just hit. The ER bay was quiet at this hour, the overnight shift giving way to the day shift, and Dr. Marcus Flint was standing at the nursing station with a chart in his hand when Voss and Emily came through the double doors. He looked up. He saw Voss first, saw the credentials, and his expression ran a quick calculation. Then he saw Emily, and whatever the calculation had been, it stopped. He knew. She could see it. The specific quality of recognition that comes when someone understands that the variable they'd been managing for 14 months had just stopped being a variable. His hand tightened on the chart. Not much. Enough. Voss said his name, said what she needed to say in the professional language of federal identification and investigative authority. Flint didn't look at Voss while she was talking. He looked at Emily. "How long?" he said. It took Emily a moment to understand the question, then she did. He was asking how long she'd known, how long she'd been here specifically for this. "Long enough," she said. He set the chart down on the nursing station counter with a care that was almost theatrical, the way people handle objects when they're trying to look composed. 2 nurses at the far end of the station had stopped moving. A tech near Bay 2 was standing very still. "I want my attorney," Flint said. "Of course," Voss said. "You'll have that opportunity." They walked him out. Emily stood at the nursing station and watched him go, watched the same doors she'd walked through 1,000 times close behind him, and then she was standing in the ER alone, except for the staff who were slowly returning to motion around her like water closing over a disturbance. Rebecca, the nurse who'd been pressed against the wall in the east corridor the night before, appeared from Bay 6. She looked at Emily with an expression that held several things at once. "Is it over?" she asked. Emily looked at the doors. "Almost," she said. Her phone rang. It was Margot in Billings. She answered immediately. "I found him," Margot said. "Case 41. He's at the 3rd facility. He's alive, Emily. He doesn't know what's happening, but he's alive, and he's been asking to go home for 6 months, and nobody would tell him why he couldn't." Emily turned away from the ER bay so the staff couldn't see her face while she processed that. She cleared her throat. "What's his name?" Margot told her. Emily wrote it down on a piece of nursing station paper with a pen she borrowed from Rebecca. Because writing things down was what you did, because documentation mattered, because you kept copies of everything. "Tell him someone's coming," she said. "Tell him it's almost done." She stayed in the ER for another 20 minutes after Margot's call. Not because there was anything left for her to do there, but because she needed a moment that wasn't moving, and the ER was the one place in the building where stillness didn't look suspicious. People stood still in ERs. They collected themselves. It was understood. Rebecca brought her a cup of coffee without being asked, set it on the counter, and went back to her station without making it a thing. It was a small gesture, and Emily noted it the way she noted most things, quietly, without attaching too much to it, because attaching too much to small gestures was how you ended up disappointed by the world on a regular basis. She drank the coffee and thought about a man in a Billings care facility who'd been asking to go home for 6 months and hadn't been told why he couldn't. His name was Raymond Cho. 71 years old, retired county surveyor, admitted to Pinecrest Regional 8 months ago for what his intake record listed as cognitive evaluation following a minor stroke. His daughter had been the one who'd filed the initial inquiry with the patient advocacy organization. His daughter was one of the 7 located family members. She'd been told her father was in stable condition at a long-term care facility and that the transfer had been medically recommended and that visitation was limited due to his condition. She'd accepted that because people accept things when institutions say them with enough authority, and because she didn't know yet that the institution saying them had been running an unconsented research protocol on her father for the better part of a year. Emily called Rourke from the ER bay. "Cho's daughter," she said. "Someone needs to call her before she hears this from a news broadcast." A pause on Rourke's end. "I have an agent heading to Billings now." "The daughter is in Raven Falls. She's local. She has no idea her father is 40 miles away." Emily looked at the double doors. "She deserves to hear it from a person, not a television." Another pause. "Do you have her contact?" "I can find it." She did. It took her 11 minutes and 2 phone calls through channels she wasn't technically supposed to be using anymore, but the information existed in the documentation she'd transmitted weeks ago, and the contact at the other end of the chain had it and passed it along without editorial comment. She called the daughter herself. Her name was Sue Jin, and she answered on the second ring with the alertness of someone who'd been sleeping lightly or not at all. And Emily told her what she knew in the same ordered way she'd been telling things to people all night. Facts first, then what they meant, then what happened next. She kept her voice level. She didn't editorialize. When she finished, there was a silence on the other end that lasted long enough to be real. "He's alive," Sujin said. Not a question. Making herself believe it. "He's alive," Emily said, "and someone's going to take you to him today, if you want." Another silence. Then a sound that Sujin probably didn't intend to make, brief and unguarded, the sound of 6 months of not knowing suddenly having an answer. "I want," she said. Emily arranged it. Then she put her phone in her pocket and stood in the Montana morning for a moment longer, and then she walked out of the hospital for what she understood would be one of the last times. The arrests came formally over the next 18 hours, and they came publicly in the way that federal actions at a regional hospital come publicly, with county sheriff vehicles and federal vehicles in the parking lot, with the news vans multiplying from 2 to 5, with a statement from the DOJ regional office that said enough to confirm the outline and not enough to compromise the prosecution. Gordon Tate was the first. He was processed at the county facility before noon, and the county facility was not large and not private, and the 2 local reporters who'd been following the story since the news vans appeared had the footage of his arrival. He walked in between 2 federal agents with his jacket over his arm and his attorney beside him, and his face doing the thing faces do when they've resolved into a fixed expression because all the other expressions have been used up. Donna Price was interviewed at length and wasn't charged that day, but the interview lasted 4 hours, and the investigators who conducted it left with documentation that would be relevant later. She was placed on administrative leave by a hospital board that was, by that afternoon, itself under significant institutional pressure from the state health authority. The charge nurse who had scheduled Emily for every impossible shift, who had left her off communication chains and paired her with the least experienced techs. She sat in an interview room for 4 hours, and at the end of it she looked like someone who understood, for the first time, the weight of what she'd been participating in by not looking too hard at things that were worth looking at. Emily didn't feel satisfied by that, exactly. She felt something more complicated, which was that people who enable systems of harm by choosing not to ask questions are not the same as people who architect those systems, and the distinction mattered legally and probably morally, but it didn't make the enabling less real or less costly to the people it cost. Marcus Flint was charged by the end of the day. The communications between him and Aldous Price were not ambiguous. They documented a 3-year arrangement in which Flint had served as the clinical gatekeeper for the protocol, identifying patients who met Veltris's research criteria and routing them through the administrative track. His attorney released a statement about cooperation in context that was the kind of statement released when there isn't a better option. Flint himself said nothing publicly. Emily saw a photograph of him outside the federal building in Missoula. It appeared in the online version of the county paper that afternoon. and he looked like a man she didn't entirely recognize, which made sense because the version of him she'd known for 14 months had been a performance, and performances don't survive the removal of their audience. Aldous Price was detained by Interpol at a transit hub in Frankfurt 41 hours after the federal warrant was issued. His attorney in the United States began filing procedural objections before he'd even been processed, which was the behavior of someone with resources and the behavior of someone who already knew the outcome and was trying to slow it down rather than stop it. Victor Hale entered a cooperation agreement. The terms were not publicly released, but the result was visible. Within 72 hours of the initial investigation, the names of 3 additional individuals in the state licensing structure who had received payments from the Veltris adjacent network were in federal hands. 2 of them were charged. One of them was a deputy director of the state health authority who had been in his position for 9 years, which explained a great deal about why the complaints that had reached that office had not gone further. The Veltris biomedical offices in Denver were searched on the 3rd day. The Denver operation was larger than the Pinecrest arrangement suggested. Pinecrest had been one site in a multi-facility research network that had been operating on a similar model in 2 other states. Those investigations were opened. They were separate cases with separate timelines, but they were connected, and the connection made the Pinecrest case more significant than a regional medical fraud. It made it a federal pattern. Emily learned most of this not from being present, but from Rourke, who called her on the 3rd morning to give her a status update that was more thorough than was strictly necessary, and which Emily understood as a form of professional courtesy. You spend 14 months building a case, and the people who benefit from it owe you the information. She was at Kay's kitchen table when the call came. She'd slept 9 hours, which was the most she'd slept in a single stretch in months, and she'd woken up with the specific physical heaviness of a body that had been running on urgency and was now confronting its absence. Price's extradition will take time, Rourke said. His attorneys are going to fight it, but the evidence we have doesn't require his testimony to proceed on the domestic charges. The 3 patients, Emily said, the ones who died. A pause. Medical examiners reviewing. 2 of the deaths are being reclassified as under investigation. The 3rd, Rourke's voice shifted slightly. The 3rd had complicating natural factors. It may not be possible to establish causation. I want to be honest with you about that. Emily had known that was a possibility. The law required causation. Reality didn't always provide it in neat enough form to meet that standard. 2 families might get an answer. One might get only the knowledge that their person had been used, which was its own kind of answer, and not the one that felt like justice. The civil exposure for the families, she said. Substantial. Veltris has assets. The DOJ Civil Division is engaged. It's going to take years, but the families will be represented, and the legal exposure is real. Years. Emily looked at the kitchen table. Kay had left a section of the local paper on it, folded to the front page, which carried a photograph of Pinecrest Regional's exterior with federal vehicles visible, and a headline that she read and then set face down because the headline was a simplification, and simplifications bothered her even when they were accurate in the general direction. Raymond Cho, she said. Home, Rourke said. His daughter picked him up yesterday afternoon. He's going to need follow-up care, but he's oriented and he's communicating clearly. His cognitive status is better than the Veltris documentation suggested. Another pause. The Veltris documentation on his cognitive status appears to have been altered. Emily absorbed that. A man's mental competency, misrepresented in records, to keep him in a facility he couldn't advocate his way out of. She thought about what it took to do that to someone. Not the mechanics of it. The mechanics were easy to understand. The interior decision to do it. The way a person had to reorganize their relationship to other people's lives to make that seem like something that could be done. She didn't have a satisfying framework for it. She wasn't sure one existed. Emily, Rourke said, your formal commendation is being processed. It'll come through the joint oversight structure. I don't know exactly what form it takes. That's above my level, but it's happening. Okay, Emily said. That's all you have? She thought about it. What would be more appropriate? Most people have something to say about it. I don't need a commendation to know what I did, she said, but I appreciate that it's coming. Rourke made a sound that might have been a laugh and might have been something else. You're a difficult person to debrief. I've been told that. They ended the call. Kay appeared in the kitchen doorway with the particular timing she had of arriving when conversations concluded, which Emily had always suspected was deliberate and had never confirmed. "Coffee?" Kay said. "Yes." Kay poured 2 cups and sat down at the table. She looked at the newspaper face down on the table and didn't turn it over. "You didn't tell me what you actually did," Kay said. "You told me you went back to help with something. You didn't tell me what." "No." "Are you going to?" Emily looked at her coffee. "Some of it, eventually." Kay nodded as if this were a perfectly reasonable timeline. "Are you leaving Raven Falls?" Emily had been thinking about that since the parking lot, in the margins of everything else. The apartment on Calloway Street. The lease had 2 months left. The library card. The specific geography of a city she'd spent 14 months learning in a particular way, the way you learn a place when you're inside it for operational purposes, which was different from the way you learned a place when you were just living in it. She didn't know the difference yet, personally. She'd been operational in Raven Falls the entire time she'd been there. She didn't know what living in it would feel like. "I don't know," she said. Kay wrapped both hands around her cup. "You know what I found out when I retired from county administration? 30 years I'd been managing things, fixing things that were broken. That was my whole identity." She looked at the table. "When I stopped, I had no idea what I was without a problem to solve. Took me about a year to figure out that was actually the interesting question, not the problems." "The year." Emily looked at her. "I'm not telling you what to do," Kay said. "I'm too old to waste time on that." She sipped her coffee. "I'm just saying the next part is also worth something." Okay. The formal public ceremony was 6 weeks later. It was not the kind of ceremony Emily would have designed for herself, which is to say, it was more people and more attention than she found comfortable, and the citation that was read aloud by a state official described her in language that was accurate in the factual details and slightly heroic in the framing, which she understood was how these things worked. You couldn't issue a public commendation in the bureaucratic language of an after-action report. The language had to carry weight for people who weren't in the room where the actual things happened. It was held in the main lobby of Pinecrest Regional Hospital, which had been operating under emergency administrative oversight for 6 weeks, while the state health authority established new leadership. The lobby had been rearranged for the occasion. Chairs, a small platform, a cluster of officials that included a federal representative from the DOJ, a colonel she recognized, Patricia Voss in a different coat than the midnight one, and representatives from 3 of the patient families. Darlene Fossey was there. She sat in the front row with her hands in her lap and her back straight, and when Emily looked at her before the ceremony started, Fossey gave her a small nod that contained more than most speeches did. Sujin Cho was there with her father, who sat beside her in a chair that had been positioned where he could see the platform without straining. Raymond Cho was 71 and had spent several months in a care facility under false pretenses and had the particular alert watchfulness of someone who had learned not to trust the explanation being offered. Emily shook his hand before the ceremony. He held her hand for a moment longer than a handshake required. "You're the one who found me," he said. "Colleague found you," she said. "I just made the call." He looked at her with eyes that had the quality of someone who was choosing, deliberately, not to argue. The ceremony itself took 45 minutes. Several people spoke. Emily spoke last, briefly, because she'd been asked to say something and she'd thought about it long enough to say something true rather than something polished. She stood at the platform in the hospital lobby, in front of the staff who remained, in front of the families, in front of the cameras that would put the footage on the evening news across 3 Montana markets, and she said, "I came here to do a job. I did it. I want to be clear about that because I think there's a version of this story where what I did gets described as extraordinary, and I want to push back on that a little." She paused. "What I did was notice things and write them down and not stop doing that when someone told me to stop. That's not extraordinary. That's what every person in a healthcare environment is supposed to do and often can't because the systems they're operating inside make it too expensive. The extraordinary part, the part that actually required something, was done by the patients. The people who tried to report what was happening to them and got pressured into silence. Darlene Fossey, who filed a complaint and had it used against her. Raymond Cho, who was kept in a facility for months and kept asking to go home. Gerald Wynne, who held on to 2 years of documentation when holding on to it, had real costs. She looked at the room. I did my job. They survived something. That's not the same category of thing. She stepped back from the platform. There was applause. She stood through it because you stood through it and didn't look uncomfortable, even if you were. Afterward, in the reception that occupied the lobby, in the way receptions occupy spaces, awkwardly, with too many people trying to have genuine conversations in a setting designed for traffic flow, the colonel found her near the windows. That was well said, he told her. It was true, she said, which was her main criterion. There's something I need to tell you, officially. He stood beside her, looking at the lobby rather than at her, which she recognized as his way of saying something that he wanted to feel less formal than it was. Your status is being formally restored. Captain, not active. The records that were sealed when you transitioned to the operational posting will be amended to reflect the full service history. He paused. That's what gets read into the public record. What you did here and what you did before. She thought about the name she'd lived under for 3 years, the nursing license, the apartment, the library card. Emily Brooks stays, she said. That's your call? I know. She looked at the lobby. It's a good name. I don't see why I should have to give it back. He almost smiled. It was the closest she'd seen him come to one. Well, the verdicts came in stages over the following months, which was how justice actually worked when it worked, incrementally, and with paperwork and delays that had nothing to do with the severity of what had been done. It was not a clean process. It was a slow one, which was different. Gordon Tate was sentenced first. 11 years, federal. The financial fraud alone would have been significant. The additional charges relating to his role in the suppression of the Fossey complaint and the alteration of Raymond Cho's cognitive assessments made the sentence heavier. His attorney appealed. The appeal was denied. Marcus Flint surrendered his medical license before his sentencing date, which his attorneys argued should be considered as evidence of accountability, and which the federal judge noted in her ruling and did not find mitigating enough to affect the outcome substantially. 7 years. The medical board's action was permanent. Aldous Price's extradition was completed 4 months after the initial investigation. His trial was separate, longer, more complex, because the Veltris network extended beyond Pinecrest, and the prosecution was building a case that addressed all of it. Emily provided testimony. She sat in a federal courtroom in Missoula and answered questions for 3 hours in the direct and careful way she'd been trained to testify, and told what she knew in the order she'd learned it. And when Price's attorney tried to characterize her presence at Pinecrest as itself a form of institutional manipulation, she looked at the attorney and said, "The manipulation happened to the patients. I was there to document it. Those aren't the same thing." And then waited for the next question. Price was convicted on 14 counts. The sentencing was 18 years. Victor Hale's cooperation agreement resulted in a reduced charge, which was the agreement and was therefore not a surprise. He was sentenced to 4 years and stripped of every professional credential he held. At his sentencing, he made a statement that included the word regret several times in a way that landed differently depending on who was listening. Emily was not in the courtroom for his sentencing. She'd given what she had to give to that process and didn't feel the need to watch the end of it. She heard about it from Rourke, who called with the same thoroughness she'd maintained throughout. "He asked about you," Rourke said. "What did he say?" "He asked if you were going to be there." "And?" "We told him we didn't know." A pause. "I think he wanted to say something to you." Emily thought about Victor Hale in the corridor on her first morning, telling her she was finished, watching her with the certainty of a man who'd done this before and expected the outcome to be the same. She thought about what she might want from whatever he had to say, and she didn't find much. "Whatever he wants to say, he can say it to himself," she said. "That's free." Rourke made that sound again, the one that lived between a laugh and something else. She stayed in Raven Falls. It surprised her, the staying. She'd assumed she'd leave, assumed it in the way you assume things that seem like the obvious next step. And then the lease came up for renewal, and she signed it, and by the time she understood she was staying, she'd already been staying for 2 months. The work changed. She went back to nursing, which required conversations with the licensing board about her operational posting, and resulted in a notation in her file that was unusual enough that the licensing board coordinator called her twice to confirm the details were correct. They were. She was reinstated to full practice status. The new hospital administration reached out about a position 3 months after the investigation closed. The interim CEO, a woman named Dr. Paulette Warren, who had been brought in by the state to rebuild the institution's clinical integrity, sat across from Emily in an office that still had the faint institutional quality of a room that had belonged to someone else and hadn't fully settled into its current occupant. "I won't pretend this isn't complicated," Warren said. "You exposed serious failures in this institution. Coming back is complicated," Emily agreed. "I was going to say significant." Warren looked at her directly. "I'm not offering you this because it makes a good story. I'm offering it because the Patient Safety Committee needs someone with your specific background, and because half the nursing staff has asked about you in the last month, and because, frankly, I'd rather have you in the building asking hard questions than anywhere else." Emily thought about that, about the asking of hard questions, and what it cost and what happened when institutions actually wanted the answers. She took the position. It wasn't the same as before. She wasn't undercover, wasn't building a case, wasn't copying files to an encrypted drive under her car seat. She was a nurse doing patient safety oversight in a hospital that was, slowly and imperfectly, trying to become something different than what it had been. The process was unglamorous. It involved a lot of committee meetings and policy review, and the particular frustration of systems change, which was that it happened in increments too small to feel like progress, until you looked back and realized you'd covered ground. She filed maintenance reports. They got addressed. Recon was reassigned to the new security structure under a handler who'd been brought in as part of the operational overhaul. The handler's name was Torres, and he was 28 and took the job seriously in the way of someone who understood he was working with an animal that had been badly managed by the previous setup and needed consistency more than authority. He did good work with the dog. Emily still passed the kennel sometimes. She didn't make a point of it, but occasionally she stopped and Recon would come to the fence and press against it in the particular way he had, and Torres would watch and say nothing because there wasn't anything to say about it that the dog wasn't already communicating. She ran into Danny Okafor in the corridor one afternoon, 4 months after the investigation. He'd been given a commendation by the new administration for his role in the events of that night. The badge, the communication, the small acts of a 23-year-old who'd decided to text someone he trusted instead of looking away. He wore the commendation on his lanyard, which was a very Danny thing to do. "You look different," he said. She thought about that. Same amount of sleep deprivation. "No." He looked at her. "Before, you always looked like you were waiting for something, like you were watching the door." He shrugged, slightly self-conscious about the observation. "You don't look like that anymore." She didn't have an immediate answer for that. She thought about it later, standing in the parking lot at the end of a shift that had included 2 committee meetings and a difficult conversation with a physician who didn't like being asked why a protocol had been followed incorrectly, and she thought about what it felt like to be somewhere without watching the door. It felt like something she was still learning. There was no version of what had happened that didn't leave residue. 3 families who'd lost people and would carry the uncertainty about what that loss actually meant for as long as they lived. 36 patients who'd had things done to their bodies without their knowledge, and who would have to make sense of that in whatever ways their lives allowed. A community whose primary healthcare institution had been revealed as something it shouldn't have been, and which was now in the slow work of becoming something better, which required trust, and trust was the most breakable thing. None of that resolved into a clean outcome, because nothing that size resolved cleanly. What it resolved into was accountability, partial, imperfect, hard-won, the kind that required ongoing maintenance because the forces that created the original problem didn't disappear when the immediate perpetrators were removed. They required systems, oversight, people willing to ask questions and write things down and not stop when they were told to stop. She knew how to do that. She was going to keep doing it. On a Tuesday in May, she drove out to see Kay Stamos, who was planting something in her backyard, and looked up when Emily came around the side of the house and said, "You didn't call. You would have told me not to come. I would have told you to come for dinner instead of 3 in the afternoon." But Kay was already standing up and brushing her hands on her knees. "Come inside, I made something." It was soup again. Different ingredients, same salt ratio, which was to say too much, which was exactly what Emily expected, and therefore exactly what she wanted. She ate it at the kitchen table while Kay talked about her garden and the neighbors, and a book she'd read that she thought Emily would find either compelling or infuriating, and possibly both. The afternoon light came through the kitchen window and moved across the table in the slow way of light that isn't being watched. She thought about a girl who had become a soldier, who had become a medic, who had become someone that institutions put in hard places to see what was actually there. She thought about what got left behind in each of those transitions and what got carried forward. She thought about the things she'd told the lobby full of people, that what she'd done was notice things and write them down, and she thought about whether that was underselling it or whether it was actually the most honest description of a life built on the premise that what you pay attention to matters, that the record exists, that the truth survives if someone decides it's worth fighting for. She hadn't set out to be that person. She just kept being it when it would have been easier not to. That was the part nobody put in the commendation. The accumulation of ordinary choices, each one small enough to rationalize away, each one just difficult enough to cost something. The generator report nobody followed up on. The transfer log that didn't add up. The question she asked in a corridor when the safe thing was to keep walking. You couldn't build a life on the extraordinary moments. They were too far apart. You built it on the Tuesday afternoons when you noticed something, wrote it down, and didn't look away. She finished the soup. She helped Kay do the dishes, which Kay pretended to resist and then allowed, because they both understood the gesture was the point. She drove home through Raven Falls as the May evening came in soft, and the mountains to the west turned the particular color they turned when the light was going. She had a committee meeting tomorrow, a policy revision to finish, a follow-up conversation with a department head who was going to be resistant but not immovable, because in her experience, most people who were resistant to accountability were not actually resistant to doing the right thing. They were resistant to the discomfort of being shown where they'd been wrong. That was manageable. That was just the work. She parked in front of her building on Callaway Street and sat in her car for a minute in the habit she'd developed that had nothing to do with surveillance now and everything to do with the decompression of a day, the few minutes of quiet between the world's demands and the door. The name on her license was Emily Brooks. The service record in a sealed file somewhere had her other name on it, and both were accurate, and she'd stopped needing them to be reconciled. She was one person. She'd done what she'd done. She was still doing it. That was enough. That was, in the end, the only thing it needed to be. Oh. The people who tried to erase her never understood the basic arithmetic. Silence doesn't protect institutions. It only delays the reckoning. And some people, the ones who've learned that the truth is worth more than their comfort, will keep showing up to do the accounting, shift after shift, until the numbers finally tell the whole story. If you've ever stayed quiet to keep the peace when speaking up was the harder thing, you already know what it costs. You also already know what it's worth.